Disclaimer: I am a law student. Any legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hi. Before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and silence that. Now, we're going to do something interesting today. We're going to start with 3 hypotheticals. First, imagine that we have a baker. Let's say that they live somewhere in the South. Let's say more the rural South, the kind of place that you probably, if you are of a minority status, probably want to avoid. And let's say that this baker gets some customers that comes into his shop. Let's say it's 2 men, and it's 2 men who go up to him and ask this baker to make a cake for their wedding. And let's say in response, the baker responds that he will never make a cake for them. And specifically, the reason that he says he will never make a cake for them is that he will not do something which he says, quote, violates his religious beliefs. All right, so that's first hypothetical. Second hypothetical. Let's say that we have the owner of a barbecue shop. For simplicity, we'll also make it in the South. And let's say that this barbecue shop owner gets someone who walks into her shop. And let's say it's a woman of color. Let's say that this woman of color walks into the barbecue shop and asks to be seated and to be served. And let's say that the barbecue shop owner ends up refusing this person. And let's say that, without using specific language, I'm going to let you use your imagination. But let's say that this person uses some language that we consider to be largely distasteful in society, in saying that she will never, ever serve someone who is insert word, who walks into her barbecue shop. Again, I'll let you assume there. I don't think it's too hard to tell what she was saying. So that's the second hypothetical. Third hypothetical. Let's say that we have a trans woman who, let's say that she walks into a McDonald's. And for consistency, we'll also make it in the South, although this probably doesn't matter as much, unfortunately, in today's society. Let's say that she walks into a McDonald's, and while she's waiting in line, let's say that, to use language that I have mixed feelings on, she doesn't pass perfectly. But, she's just going about her business, so she stands in line at McDonald's and she's waiting to place her order. When suddenly someone behind her decides to get her attention and decides to harass this woman, saying that she is delusional, deranged, and someone who will never actually be a woman. Question: what is the common characteristic or trait of all of the 3 people from these hypotheticals? So hey, welcome. It's great to have y'all here. This is the second video sort of looking at the whole debacle, or the exchanges, whatever you want to call it, between Xanderhal and Essence of Thought. A lot has happened over the past couple weeks, so what I'm going to do today is effectively, for people who have watched my first video on sort of the subject about armchair psychology, which I have previously taken down, what I am going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about those arguments I made there. I'm going to rehash some of them, and some of them will be sort of moot points But I'm bringing, like, there are points which I have talked to Xanderhal in essence have thought about, but I'm going to bring them back up, A, because it's important to the larger discussion that we have that framework, and B, because it's good for educational value, because ultimately that's what I'm trying to do with my channel, is just to try and equip us all with, you know, some common ground and some common principles that we can abide by as a community. All right? So, with that said, where we can start as far as the facts goes is this will go back to the stream that Xanderhal had on March 21st. It was the stream that Xanderhal had. It's called Essence of Thought is a Weasley Little Liar. And this is sort of where the issues that we're talking about today came up. I'm going to let this play. I'm not going to, just like the last time I did the video on this, I'm not going to mince any of his words. I'm just going to let it play, and you can all do with it what you will. All right? And then I'll talk a little bit more about how it's relevant after.
Can I try to rephrase my position in the most concise way possible so you guys understand what I'm talking about here? Because I feel like my take isn't very controversial, and there's just a miscommunication happening. Can I try to do that very quickly? Can I do that really quick? I'm going to bring out paint, all right? All right. So there's a thing, very well documented, I believe, called the cycle of abuse, okay? So let's say you're like a little child, okay? And you get abused when you're a kid, right? You know, this is you, little kid, right? And you get a, you know, let's say this is like a hand slapping him across the face, right? Boom, you're getting abused when you're a kid, okay? Sucks. Terrible. Bad. Very not good, okay? Are you a psychologist, Xanderhal? Yes. So let's say you grow up and you get abused. Is it unreasonable? I know it. Listen, I know it's armchair psychology, okay? But I feel like this is something most people that have done a bit of research can authoritatively have an opinion on, all right? Let's say you get abused when you're growing up. Do you think it is unreasonable to say, I use brush, yeah. Do you think it is unreasonable to make the case that this can result in some mental health issues as you get older? I know it did for me. No. I'm not making an argument here. I'm literally just asking chat their opinion on this, okay? I'm asking chat for their opinion on this. Do you think it is unreasonable to say that if you were abused when you were younger, when you get older, you have a higher likelihood of having mental illnesses? Sure, but it's not a personality disorder. A personality disorder... Wait, hold on. I actually have a question, chat. Just stop. I'm literally... Oh my god, chat. I'm trying to learn from you. I'm actually curious and trying to learn from you, chat. Can you please educate me on this instead of just saying, just stop, dude? Can you please? Please. Please, chat. I love you all. Stop just saying, just stop. And help me out here, okay? I'm curious. Are personality disorders, and this is a genuine question, I want to know if anybody who has, can speak authoritatively on this. Is there a classification for personality disorders that is, you're coming off more? No, I'm asking genuine questions. These aren't leading questions. Is there, because I want you guys to, point out where I go wrong here, okay? So, are personality disorders classified as, a mental illness? A personality disorder is a type of mental disorder in which you have a rigid and unhealthy pattern of thinking, functioning, and behaving. A person with a personality disorder has trouble perceiving and relating to situations and people. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Just to admit the disorder part where you say abusive personality. Well, yeah, they definitely have abusive personality. That's definitely true. Maybe that's just, the wording that I have here. I'm assuming that their abusive personality is attributed to some disorder, maybe? Could that be the meme? That could probably be the issue here. I mean, I know, they admit to having some form of mental illness, and they have abusive personality. Maybe that's where the miscommunication is happening here. Wait, chat, is that where the miscommunication is happening here? Okay, I think we're good. I should clarify. I don't think that the reason that they are abusive, entirely at least, is because of their abusive personality or their mental health issues, okay? I think that it's definitely a part of it. However, I don't think abusive personality disorder is a thing. They have mental health issues and an abusive personality.
To repeat, so when I last made my video covering this, effectively where I led with from here was to talk about, yes, Xanderhal, you identified that there is a distinction between having a mental health issue and being a bad person, right? And that is a relevant distinction. But there's still a lot of problems with what you're doing, because it doesn't really matter if you draw a distinction between those two things, because A, there is still a problem in coming to the conclusion that person has a mental health disorder, and B, this is a kind of opinion which has such a high likelihood of prejudicing your argument that it's going to really tamper or really dampen the things that you dealt with. And yeah, chat, I saw that. There's a little bit of a lag, but I have corrected the issue. And so really what we're getting into is the first issue that I want to talk about. Oh, crap. How do I... Boom. 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 So effectively, this brings us to the first issue. All right? Can Xanderhal make this argument? Can Xanderhal make the argument that essence of thought has this sort of mental issue? And that's sort of what I want to dig into first, is like being able at a fundamental level to be able to say that someone suffers from a mental disease or defect when we're operating in this sort of a community. All right? Now, because I cannot actually rely on legal principles or legal ideas, I'm going to be introducing a new arbitrary rule of internet argumentation, which goes to expert opinions. Someone who is qualified as an expert may, by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, may give an opinion relating to that experience if A, that expert's scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge will help a viewer to understand the evidence or to determine a fact and issue. B, the opinion is based on sufficient facts or data. And C, the opinion is the product of reliable principles and methods. And one more. And the expert has reliably applied the principles and methods to the facts at issue. Now, the problem here is that when you're looking at this standard, you do not meet any of the criteria to be able to come to a conclusion that someone has a mental disease or defect. And again, we've talked about this already, but to go through it, in order to make this kind of a conclusion, you really do need some kind of background in psychology, some kind of specialized schooling, and you need to go through the steps of showing us about how that expertise relates to the conclusion that you came to. Yeah, you talked about your own personal experience with mental trauma, and yeah, you talked a little bit about how Essence of Thought has talked about it on their own, but for you to draw that independent conclusion on your own does not satisfy any of these requirements here. Now, the reason why this rule exists, or at least the rule that this is based off of, is that in the court of law, what we want to do is we want to protect people from evidence that is not trustworthy. All right, what we want to do is we want to protect you as the viewer, as ultimately the person that matters, because like I have my own opinions, but like you as the audience, you are the people who really have opinions that matter, at this point, because, you by giving us views, and you're the people who are ascribing us a larger platform. So we as content creators, we have a standard that we have to meet to be able to give certain opinions, right? And we have to meet that standard because we have to protect you, because otherwise we can lie to you, right? And we want to be able to hold content creators to a really high degree of credibility. And so that's why on this first issue, it really doesn't seem like Xanderhal was able to say this. Now, people might be asking, all right, well, if Xanderhal isn't able to say that, well, what is Xanderhal able to say? And that brings us to the second point, which is Rule 2.0, as I am calling it, lay opinions. If someone is not speaking as an expert, their opinion should be limited to one that is A, rationally based on their perception, B, helpful to clearly understand another aspect of their opinion or to determining a fact and issue, and C, not based on scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge within the scope of Rule 2.1. And that's roughly adapted from Rule 7.1 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. And so the reason why, effectively to go through this, you can talk about things which any reasonable person would be able to, right? Like, for example, Xanderhal talks about how this was, talks about how Essence of Thought would be a bad person by virtue of the fact that they were abused as a child, and by virtue of being abused, that might lead someone to be an abuser later on. That straddles the line, but the justification that Xanderhal gives is the fact that Xanderhal was himself abused as a child. And that brings us sort of into the realm of rationally, like based on his personal experience, based on his personal conception, right? Xanderhal is able to talk about this. Let me edit this a little bit so that isn't... I'll have to fix that later. But anyway, the point is that Xanderhal was able to tie it to his personal understanding of sort of how being abused as a child can lead someone to be an abuser when they grow up. And to that extent, what he said about whether or not Essence of Thought was a bad person, that's fine, because that just goes to his personal understanding of things. But the minute that he tries to take that into the realm of, and that implies that they have a mental defect, that is overstepping the line. That is going into an expert opinion. That is something that he is not allowed to say, because he hasn't told us what gives him the right to be able to give that sort of expert opinion. All right? And that's really sort of that's really like the main point that I wanted to make in my first video. Now, going on to sort of the second issue that I want to talk about is that, all right, even if he was able to make that argument, there's also the consideration of, should he, right? Even if he is able to make that argument, even if he's able to make the argument that Essence of Thought suffers from sort of mental disease or defect, why does he need to? Because when you start arguing that someone suffers from a mental disease or defect, it really, really has some negative impacts on that person's credibility. And it kind of subverts any attempt to engage in that argument, right? And this really connects back to what we're going to be calling Rule 2.2, prejudice, confusion, waste of time, or other reasons to exclude, all right? What we should do is we should consider excluding substantive opinions, so like opinions that might be totally valid, right? Like logically coherent and all that, from consideration if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the viewers, undue delay, wasting time. That's actually in there. I forgot to make that into another. Or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. All right? That last one. And that's roughly adapted from Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. Now, what's the reason that this rule exists? Well, I mean, let's look at this. I mean, we can just explore this situation, right? Let's say that Xanderhal was right. And let's say that meant that Essence of Thought, and maybe any other trans person, because there's kind of an issue where Xanderhal's argument could be taken to be applied to any trans person by the way that he phrased it. That's another issue. Xanderhal has later said that that was not his intention, so I'm not going to be addressing that in too much depth. But let's say that Xanderhal was right about Essence of Thought, and that Essence of Thought had mental diseases or defects or issues that impacted, arguably, Essence of Thought's arguments. Well, the thing is, when you are able to make that sort of argument, it really incentivizes you to disconnect with the merits of the argument that Essence of Thought is making entirely, right? When you argue that someone has a mental disease and you just use that to paint their entire argument as invalid, that's really dangerous, because not only are you opening the box to that person not being credible, even if they might, like, on the merits of their argument, have like the most ironclad, the best possible argument that they could make. Like let's just say that Essence of Thought was objectively right. I'm not saying that they are, but let's just say for sake of argument that they were, right? Then this would give Xanderhal the ability to completely disengage with that argument. If you take it to the logical extreme, then it means that Xanderhal can disengage with anyone who has arguably a mental disease or defect, and to the furthest extreme, anyone who's trans, because they might have a mental disease or defect, right? And that's a crazy big issue. This is so much potential for unfair prejudice that even if you can make it, there's a really strong policy argument that he just shouldn't. And that was really the crux. All of that and the totality of it, that was the substance of my previous video. All right. That's the TLDR. That's bringing it all together. And what I did at the end of it was I made a point to clarify that this was not meant as a criticism of Xanderhal, right? I mean, constructively, sure. But it wasn't meant to be an attack on him. It wasn't meant to be something to like slander his name or call him a bigot or anything like that, right? That's not what it was. What this was me as someone who was watching him, someone who, you know, is a fan of his, like, and now we've gotten the chance to talk, and, you know, I feel a lot closer to him, right? You know, this is not meant to be something to harm his credibility or to hurt him, but it's just meant to sort of further this conversation about something which arguably was an honest mistake and how to move forward from it. Fortunately, after this video had come out, I don't know if y'all can hear there are sirens in the background. Baltimore is constantly burning. But anyway, after I put out my original video, Xanderhal and Essence of Thought both actually ended up reaching out to me, which was crazy because I'm still a relatively small creator and I didn't think that I would get that much recognition. I certainly hoped that it would, but, you know, I didn't exactly get my hopes up. But I was able to start a conversation with both people, and since then, wow, has a lot happened. Like, wow, has a lot happened. And it's been really interesting, and I've been able to talk with Essence of Thought, and I've been able to talk with Xanderhal, and I've been able to talk with a lot of the parties involved, including people like Sash or Jamie or Black Magic Bimbo, and mind you, to everyone, and I understand that people in the chat probably have very mixed feelings about everyone involved, or very strong feelings about everyone involved, and understand I'm trying to be as objective as a third party that I can be. And so I'm like, I will say that personally, so far my interactions with everyone, for the most part, has been very cooperative and very pleasant. So thank you to everyone who has been willing to talk to me and been willing to share their experience. For the purposes of this video, right, because as I talked about previously, if you need a brush up, then look at my last video on what is an argument. Essence of Thought and I got into a small argument on Twitter, right? And effectively, they responded to my video. I responded to their tweets in conversation, and I watched the video that they posted about Xanderhal, and I made like a large document sort of cataloging like all of my questions about it, any possible issues that I had, and I added them afterwards. And we had some more dialogue, and at the end of it, there were really sort of 3 major issues, technically 4, like I touched on the last video. The first overarching issue, which I touched on last video, was what is an argument. We've already talked about that. If you need a refresher, you can go and watch that. That's already up on my channel. It's been up for over the past week. Which brings us to sort of the other issues here. What is a bigot, or what does it mean to be a bigot? What is harassment? And is there space for cis people to lead discourse in the leftist/trans community, right? Those are sort of the main issues that we have. And as I said, I'm going to be addressing each of these, or I'm going to hopefully try to address each of these individually as I am able to give them the best effort that I can. And this week we are going to be talking about the next issue, which is what is bigotry? All right. So, before we go into the exact analysis, the rules, I want to talk a little bit about what it means, or the factual background, right? So what happened was that as we were talking, as we were having this back and forth conversation, and as I was doing more research, I eventually learned that the clip that I showed you at the beginning, the clip from the stream, this was not the first time that Xanderhal had made this argument. Actually, this has been something which has been a long-standing issue between Xanderhal and Essence of Thought, and that it actually goes back into earlier this past year. when Xanderhal, now from my understanding, the facts of how this erupted, of how this came about, aren't as relevant. The rough background is that this came out of a dispute between him and Essence of Thought over the situation with Natalie and having Buck Angel on her channel, right? That is my understanding. And what happened was that Xanderhal responded to Essence of Thought, and Xanderhal said this: "It's a well-known fact that EOT is legitimately an abusive piece of shit with mental issues. I hope they seek professional help so they can get better and improve their life. It can't be healthy to live like that." Essence of Thought quote tweeted and responded, "I have mental health problems. I am seeing a therapist regularly. They give me the confidence and the tools to keep fighting transphobic and ableist abuse like this. Because it's not healthy to roll over and take this sort of transphobic and ableist abuse. Quite the contrary." And honestly, this exchange singularly outlines the entire issue that I'm trying to tease out. I think that we've already sufficiently established that there are problems with what Xanderhal said, and I think that we have largely resolved them. More on that later. But it's interesting that Essence of Thought made this out to be transphobic and ableist. And in Essence of Thought's video, this is one of the examples. This is actually the very first citation that Essence of Thought has in their video on Xanderhal, right? If you go back and you watch it, where they cite Xanderhal as being a bigot, all right? And so this is sort of the thing I want to tease out. Is this actually evidence of Xanderhal being a bigot? That's what we're going to be talking about. Transition. There we go. So this comes down to, as I was doing research over the past week, there's a lot of literature on what it means to be a bigot, all right? And really what you have are two positions that I found which seem to really encapsulate it. So William Ramsey talks about bigotry in two related elements in standard definitions, right? First, you have a very strong and perhaps irrational commitment to one's viewpoint. And secondly, you have a strong intolerance towards other viewpoints and groups. John Curvino, contrarily, in their thesis or in their symposium, responded to this definition and talked about the fact that both of these qualities invite further questions. First, given that strong commitment characterizes not only bigotry but also moral conviction, isn't the irrational part crucial to the definition? It's a question that he teases out. And also, even more challenging is pinning down what strong intolerance entails. And so really, you have eventually two working definitions of bigotry. William Ramsey's definition is this: holding evaluative beliefs or other attitudes that are usually negative and directed towards members of a group of persons where the property used for grouping fails to provide proper support for the negative evaluation. John Trevino goes on to talk about his thoughts on the definition, and he agrees that group directedness is key, but also emphasizes a feature that Ramsey abandons: stubbornness. So Trevino defines bigotry as stubborn and unjustified contempt towards groups of people, typically in the context of a larger system of subordination. For the purposes of this argument, this is going to be what we're going to be relying on as our definition of bigotry. So let's define it into elements, and let's make sure that we're all on the same page so that all of us know what we're talking about. The first element is stubborn, unjustified, includes a mindset of contempt, and includes action directed towards groups of people. All right. Now we've got the elements. Let's talk about each of them a little bit individually. So stubbornness. Ramsey rejects this feature because he's worried about the counterexample of the wishy-washy racist, right? He writes, while we often regard overly obstinate proponents of certain viewpoints as stubborn or dogmatic, Relatively few people today would regard this as an essential element of bigotry. Wishy-washy racists who aren't completely confident about their views are nevertheless seen as bigots, even if they are open to abandoning those views. Moreover, few people would say that a deeply religious person with an unyielding commitment to her faith is closer to being a bigot. In fact, we seldom think of bigotry as involving the endorsement of anything. Instead, we associate bigotry with the rejection or the attacking of something with an attitude of hostility or condemnation. Now, Curvino responds to this, saying that Ramsey's concern about the deeply religious person, along with his related point about endorsement, is handled by his inclusion of unjustified contempt as a key feature of bigotry. And this is what he says. When unjustified contempt is religious in nature, as with, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church of God hates fags infamy, unyielding commitment to the faith does, in fact, bring one closer to being a bigot, quote unquote. More important, I disagree with his claim that most people would not consider dogmatism or stubbornness an essential element of bigotry, as well as his related point about the wishy-washy racist. The wishy-washy racist should not be labeled a bigot for two reasons. First, such labeling would make bigots of virtually everyone. In a society as permeated by racism as ours, most people harbor some racist beliefs and attitudes, even if only implicitly. Those who are willing to abandon those beliefs and attitudes in light of contrary evidence are not, and are generally not labeled as bigots. This is actually really interesting because this, for people who watched my last video, relates back to what is called the atmosphere effect. When we're talking about bigotry as a major premise or a rule that we want to abide by, when we're trying to figure out who to call a bigot and who to not call a bigot, when you start broadening the term so much that eventually you're able to call anyone a bigot, then the meaning of the term loses a lot of credibility. This is what Curvino is pointing out here, right? That when you broaden the term to include anyone, even people who might act in a certain way, even people who might have temporary values that go against, like that might be quote unquote transphobic or ableist or whatever, if you count those people, even if they are willing to change their minds after they are confronted with what they did or believe that was wrong, then you're able to basically categorize anyone as a bigot. For example, I think about my family, right? Who before I came out were largely conservative from a conservative small town, and most of them didn't have great views of trans people, right? And they were probably people who would be considered wishy-washy transphobes, right? People who sorta had some transphobic beliefs, but largely based on the fact that the only time they've seen someone or a trans person on national television was when Caitlyn Jenner went on to say that the hardest part of being a woman was picking what to wear in the morning. It does not invite great inferences for the random onlooker, right? And so it's important because eventually when I came out to them and I confronted to them that, like, hey, that's not the reality. Like, obviously there's a lot more things that are harder for being, that obviously there's a lot more to living as a woman than like just picking what to wear in the morning. And obviously there's a lot more nuance and all that. Then they were able to understand. And like now they're super supportive. But they would have been labeled as a bigot if we included the fact that they at one point had beliefs which weren't the greatest, but virtually out of ignorance, right? That's what we're talking about here, right? Stubbornness where you maintain those beliefs even after you are confronted with the fact that you did or believe something that's wrong. The second related reason is that the compliant bigot is a contradiction in terms. The inclusion of obstinance in the standard dictionary definition of bigotry suggests as much. So while the wishy-washy racist views are wrong and odious, they are not strictly speaking bigoted, precisely because of their responsiveness to contrary evidence. Cool. Is everyone on board? Is everyone good? That was a mouthful. I just want to make sure that we're all good. Essentially, like the first part of this analysis is looking at stubbornness, which is the idea that not only do you have certain views about these people that you are supposedly bigoted towards, but you have that even in light of countervailing evidence to the contrary. That's all that the first element is. Cool. Awesome. Moving on. So then ignorance is not necessarily bigotry. Yeah. If you don't, now someone who is ignorant and then learns more about, say, the trans community, and then does not take that education into consideration with how they continue to respond to the trans community, that is what will more determine whether or not they are a bigot, right? It's not so much that they're acting out of ignorance from the original point, but more about how they respond after learning that they were wrong. The second element is that it's unjustified. Now, this does require some definition, but we'll begin with an example. For example, we don't consider an ardent opponent of slavery a bigot because we recognize their position to be justified, right? If someone is opposed to slavery, we know that they are not a bigot because we can look at them and objectively be like, oh yeah, they're trying to abolish slavery, the literal opposite of bigotry. The slavery proponent, by contrast, would wrongly, and this is the important term, would wrongly view a strong commitment to abolition as unjustified, and thus, wrongly, judge the ardent abolitionist to be bigoted. Now, this is going to be I want you to understand the distinction that we're about to draw here. There is a difference between looking at things objectively and subjectively, all right? Objectively looks at what is true regardless of what's going on in someone's head, right? Objectively has to do with irrelevant of what someone thinks of a certain situation, what is actually happening in that situation, all right? So I want to make the distinction right here. Objectively, slavery, racism, never good, never will be, never has been. It is objectively bad, all right? But essentially what they're looking at here is whether someone can be held accountable for the subjective aspect, what they think. Because what they argue is that justification is context sensitive, and that means so is bigotry. In different historical periods and places, people's access to evidence varies, and thus so does their levels of subjective justification. That evidence includes the testimony of others. It's harder to meet the threshold for being a bigot in a society where most others share one's wrong-headed view than in one where one's bigotry is frequently and openly criticized. What this means is that if we were to travel back in time, way back in time, actually, you know what? We don't even have to talk about racism. Let's just travel back in time a couple of years to when trans people were just beginning to be talked about in larger context, right? Because most of us were probably still alive back then, unless we were exceptionally young. A lot of us still remember that. I mean, trans rights have been moving at a crazy fast speed in society, right? And so what we want to think about is effectively what this is looking at is it's looking at whether someone's understanding, their current subjective understanding of a certain group of people is justified based on the then existing social context that they live in. Let's take, for example, my family again, who probably just a couple of years ago didn't have the greatest views of trans people. Well, if we go back even further, let's say we go back 10 years to where Caitlyn Jenner is probably the only example that they have. I mean, I can't remember exactly when Caitlyn Jenner came out, but whenever she did. Let's go back to that point in history where there was not a lot of national trans representation. I mean, there's still not a lot, but go with me. Based on what they knew from society, because mind you, they lived in a town where it's not like they were exposed to a lot of trans people. It's not like that was a conversation that was happening. It's not as if they were in such a space in society or such a social circle that was talking about the subject of trans people. And they probably didn't have the greatest beliefs, but does that necessarily mean that they're bigots just because they don't have access to the correct kind of information? This is basically addressing that question, saying that they're probably not necessarily bigots because they are not in such a space where we can expect them, or we can expect a reasonable person to have been exposed to objectively the right sort of ideas. Note that the lack of justification inherent in bigotry is often accompanied by a systematic insensitivity to or discounting of evidence that would upset the bigot's views, a point also related to the stubbornness element. What philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah writes about racial prejudice, to analogize here, is apt as well. Bigotry involves a systematically distorted rationality. So when we're looking at this element, what this means is that what we're looking for is someone who lives in such a space in society, or such a society in general, where they have been exposed to objectively the right ideas, where they know that the society disapproves of racism, where they know that society disapproves of transphobia or racism or whatever, or that their current existing circle disapproves of those sorts of values and continues to have them anyway, right? This is where that is subjectively unjustified, right? Where even though they have the right ideas in their head, they still choose to pursue things that they know goes against the social grain. All right? That's unjustified. The third element of contempt. Corvino does not necessarily talk about something... I miswrote that. Corvino does not necessarily talk about like having inherent hatred towards groups of people. Contempt may be warranted or unwarranted depending on the object. Professor Michelle Mason argues it can even be a valuable moral attitude when properly focused, a morally justified response to persons who manifest a bad moral character. Thus, to say that bigots have contempt is not to say that they are necessarily hate-filled, although they may be and often are. It's rather to say that bigots have a negative evaluative attitude towards the object of bigotry. Ramsey captures this feature in terms of evaluative beliefs or other attitudes that are usually negative and directed towards members of a group. What does this mean? Well, think about the people. Let's think about the race realists for a moment. Let's think about people who are racist who, will make the argument, it's not that I hate Black people. It's just that objectively speaking, heavy quotes, there are just natural differences between us and them that make it so that they can't function at as high a mental capacity or what have you based on something like DNA or the shape of the skull or whatever sort of justification they have, right? Even though they might not be outwardly expressing some degree of hate. Maybe they've been able to justify it in their own minds that they are not hateful, right? Usually people don't like to acknowledge to themselves that they're hateful, right? Like people's ego generally won't allow it, right? Like no one likes thinking that they're a bad person. No one likes thinking that they are like objectively hateful and whatnot, right? Like people will find a way to justify what they believe. And this is effectively saying that like having contempt towards people does not necessarily mean just hate, but it can also mean twisting around a rationality such that you're able to justify your hatred in what sounds logical. All right? Corvino does not necessarily talk about something... Oh, that's the same slide. To bring us to the fourth element, groups of people. Stubborn, unjustified contempt towards an isolated individual would be wrong. Unjustified towards an would be wrong, but it's not necessarily bigotry. The contempt must be directed at the individual qua group member, meaning someone by virtue of the fact that they belong to a larger group. Moreover, not just any grouping counts. Someone who feels stubborn, unjustified contempt towards people whose names begin with the letter K would be strange but would not be a bigot. Why not? One might think that the reason is that the grouping of people whose names begin with the letter K is arbitrary, whereas bigotry typically targets constitutive features of identity such as race, ethnicity, religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. BIS question. What is the common characteristic or trait of 3 people in all the hypotheticals? Southern. I swear I'm not. I actually lived in the South for about 5 years or so. True story. There are good people down there. That's actually, I've talked about that. I believe I've talked about that before on my channel, but, you know, it's definitely a long conversation that's worth having. Now, those are the 4 elements, right? But before we get to the analysis, the next part of the analysis is really supposed to talk about how we apply those elements to the facts at hand, right? That's usually how analysis goes. You have the facts, you have the rule, or you have the issue, you have the facts, you have the rule, you have the analysis, and then the conclusion. But before then, we do have something else that we need to talk about, and that is, what standards are we going to abide by? What standards of proof? How much evidence do we need to have to be able to prove the thing that we are trying to prove, right? And that's where we're going to introduce one more. We're doing a lot today, but hey, y'all are doing great. Holy crap, we're almost an hour in. Granted, that was about 10 minutes after, so we're like 50 minutes in. I'm going to try and finish at an hour, so stick with me. We're almost there. And this goes to Rule 1.1, Standards of Proof. There are 2 primary standards of proof we could go by. One is beyond a reasonable doubt, which I'm sure you've heard of, so there's no hiding the ball there. This is the highest possible burden, and what this means is that the people who are bringing the claims against someone have the burden to disprove every reasonable alternative explanation. All right, so it's not impossible to meet this burden, right? But it just means that if there's another possible, reasonable alternative explanation for why something happened the way it did, then we can't make the conclusion that we want to, all right? Comparative to preponderance of the evidence. What this means is that it's the second highest burden, and you just need to prove that something is more likely than not. Will this be on the test? There's not going to be a test. This is just my gift to you. I'm a fucking nerd. I just do this for fun, all right? Enjoy. Have fun. I'm glad that there are so many... I'm going to stop here for a moment. I'm glad that there are so many people watching. I mean, I was unsure about how this format would go over. It is very lecture-y, but I'm glad that you all are enjoying it and finding it useful. So these are the 2 different burdens that we could go by. For preponderance of the evidence, think of like the scales of justice, right? If you have scales here, right? And let's say that there's each scale represents the amount of evidence on each side. And at this point, let's say that they're equal, and then you put like the weight of a feather on one side and it tips it just a little bit, then you conclude for that side. All right, that's what that means, right? Like the smallest amount to tip in one way or the other. All right, that's basically how you determine what the answer is to that analysis. I didn't include this in the earlier issues because to me, issues 1 and 2 are satisfied under both standards. They're pretty straightforward and honestly pretty well set. And I think that Xanderhal agrees with me. Again, more on that in a little bit. The thing about these standards is that they are both textual and policy justifications for either standard. So generally speaking, I don't know if y'all can hear that. The city is still burning around us. I apologize. But anyway, when you use a beyond a reasonable doubt, so we're just going to talk about like when you do it in the court of law, right? When you use a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, it's A, when you are in a criminal trial, and B, when you are looking at prison sentence as a punishment, right? Whereas preponderance of the evidence is used more for suits, right? Lawsuits, things which are not going to result in jail time, right? Primarily, those are the main difference in how those standards are applied. There's a lot more nuance, but again, this is not a legal conclusion. I'm not a legal professional. Hire an attorney, disclaimer, all that, right? And so the reason why I had a little trouble choosing between which standard to use here is because there's not really a great analogy to the law as far as like a claim for bigotry, right? Like this is a social content. This is like a very social construct, right? It's something which is for the most part protected as free speech. Of course, you have a right to be an asshole. Now, there are certain contexts where people's free speech are not protected. That's a whole nother discussion. But generally speaking, from my understanding as a law student, there's not a great analogy to be able to draw here. So it's not like I can textually look at one or the other. And if we're making policy decisions, this sort of goes back to the conversation on cancel culture, right? Because this could be described by Xanderhal as an attempt to cancel him, as an attempt to try and ruin his career by, coloring his moral character poorly. But Essence of Thought might also make the argument that it's not that it's like the Essence of Thought and the people who are criticizing or attacking whoever you ask, Xanderhal, are just criticizing him, and that they would argue that he would actually suffer no harm as a result, right? So you have two different arguments for either burden. I can't say which one to apply, so I'm just going to analyze under both, and I'm going to let you as the audience do what you will with that. All right? Cool. So, the analysis. First step, was he stubborn? And to this, I gotta say, arguably. Well, arguably not, I'm sorry. And we're gonna see the video. We're gonna watch another clip here so that... So what happened was that I ended up having a conversation with Xanderhal, all right? And we ended up having a conversation basically to the effect of the issues I have talked about so far. And I wanted to ask him specifically about his intent for why he made the arguments that he did. And this is a clip where he talks specifically about that. I'm going to let it play. I'm not going to interrupt. I'm not going to mince his words. I'm going to let him just say his piece, and then we'll resume the conversation. The thing that I take issue with is like taking that to imply some sort of mental defect or disease, right? Like that seems like sort of a non sequitur. It's that like as far as your argument goes, it does not necessarily seem to be like I don't understand the necessity to connect that to like a mental defect or disease. Like it seems both unnecessary for your argument. Like you don't need to make it for your merits. You can just say that Essence of Thought, if they did that, is a bad person. Mm-hmm. I don't see why trying to imply something beyond that is necessary for you.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I regret about my my covering of Essence of Thought is I don't feel like I did the best job of covering myself on the ableism claim. My claim was never that like Essence of Thought has some sort of mental condition that makes them act the way that they do, and so that is why they engage in the bad faith abusive behavior that they do. My take was more so that people who, and I think you'll agree with this, I don't think this, like you need to agree with this. Generally, if you grow up in a fucked situation, there's a high likelihood that you're going to go through your life believing that kind of behavior is acceptable, right? So if you have like abusive parents that like lashed out and hit you when you were a kid, whenever you did something wrong, you may grow up thinking that it's acceptable to hit somebody or get violent if that's what you're in. That doesn't mean you have any type of mental condition, but it is an explanation or a possible reason for why you think it would be appropriate to behave in that way. And I feel like that's probably what happened with Essence of Thought. I guess that's armchair psychology, but just from my experience, that was my assumption. Just because Essence of Thought has talked about how they've been abused in their life, and yeah, it just seemed like a reasonable conclusion to come to.
Twice in a row. I'm sorry. I'm really trying my best. It's also very late and I've had a long week. But anyway, no time for excuses. Let's get going. So in case you did not hear, effectively what Xanderhal said was this, right? That Xanderhal was not trying to talk so much about Essence of Thought having any sort of mental disease, but just that Essence of Thought, because they had certain mental issues that Essence of Thought has talked about before, and that this Essence of Thought has been the victim of abuse from a younger age, then that would make it more likely that Essence of Thought would become an abuser later on, right? And again, you can do what you want with the credibility of that statement, considering that in a clip that I played towards the beginning of the video, that Xanderhal specifically said that he was trying to make a conclusion about Essence of Thought and whether or not they had any sort of mental disease or defect, or something to that effect. I'm not going to try and tell you what you should take from that statement, but as far as our analysis goes, I'm going to take it at face value and say that he wasn't trying to imply anything negative or imply necessarily that Essence of Thought had a mental disease or defect. But again, there's conflicting evidence about that, so I'll leave that to you and your discretion. All right? Transition. So, was he stubborn? Arguably not, based on... Hey, thanks for the subscription. Based on what he said in the video, it seems like the evidence seems to weigh in favor that he was not stubborn, right? In the idea that stubbornness here would require that he would not even adhere, or he wouldn't even listen to any of the objections I brought up. And as you can see from the video, I did go through the basic claims, right? And he was receptive towards them, and we had a dialogue, right? So I think that there is more argument in the contrary to say that he wasn't stubborn than to say that he was. But you can also look at the other interactions on Twitter, which are going to be covered in the following video, right? Because let me be clear, there is so much blood on the floor, right? Like going through all of this, like going through all of the interactions between Xanderhal and Essence of Thought and Black Magic Mimbo and Sash and Jamie and everyone. Like there's so many people. And I've been trying my best to make sense of all of this, all right? I've been trying my honest, absolute best. But the point that we don't have, again, this will be explored more in the future, but the point to say right now is that there are other interactions where Xanderhal could arguably have been said to be more stubborn. That it is arguable that Xanderhal has done or said things which would imply certain beliefs that might be wrong, and that because he has not listened to the objections of these people, including Essence of Thought, then that, and he hasn't changed, because that is like a primary claim that Essence of Thought brings against him, right? Like a primary claim that Essence of Thought brings against Xanderhal is that Xanderhal is a bigot because he has done bad things, again, to be defined and determined, you know, in the separate analysis, but that he has done bad things and that he has not learned or changed his actions, right? That's essentially the argument. And if it is true that Xanderhal has done bad things or has said bad things or has bad beliefs and has not changed his opinion, then yeah, that would make him stubborn. But right now it seems like the evidence is washy. And so what I can say, oh, and before I get to the conclusions, I will say in his defense as well, so I just sort of played, you know, the advocate of Essence of Thought. Now do play the advocate of Xanderhal, right? Xanderhal, even if he did do things that were bad, it's not like the people who were criticized by him responded in the greatest fashion. As I understand it, Twitter is a pretty toxic environment, and I get that a lot of people throw shit and shade at each other, and I'm beginning to see that myself. Like, I'm getting into Twitter. By the way, you should totally follow me on Twitter. Link is down there. Oh my god, I'm sorry. But anyway, I am beginning to see that, like, it's a pretty toxic platform, right? And I get that. But when you are looking for an apology or you are looking for someone to recognize what they did was wrong, it is not exactly the greatest way to go about it by responding to that, by responding to whatever it did that allegedly hurt you, by lashing back out in return, right? Here, this is where my personal, I'm not sure if you would call it bias or experience or what have you, I think that there are different ways to take it, weighs in, right? Because I made a video criticizing Essence of Thought, or not criticizing Essence of Thought, criticizing Xanderhal on the arguments that he made, and he responded to it, and we literally had like a 2-hour conversation about it, and that does not sound like stubbornness to me, all right? And so really, at the end of the day, is it beyond a reasonable doubt that he was stubborn? No, there are plenty of reasonable doubts. Preponderance of the evidence, again, I'm sort of biased here, and I'm going to leave that to you to decide as the viewer, all right? Next, was he unjustified? Here, a better way to ask this question is, does he genuinely believe that the opinions of trans people can categorically be dismissed because they experience abuse? And the answer is probably not. Pertinent to the clip that we just watched a little bit ago, right? Like he explicitly said, and again, you can call into question the validity of this. That's a whole nother discussion. I am taking it as valid, or I'm taking it as a valid representation of what he believes, right? And the fact of the matter is, he went out of his way to say that wasn't the case. I even asked him explicitly at one point, I can't remember if that was in the clip that I played or not, but I asked him explicitly if this was his belief, and he said no. He also said that that was a lie, and that's a bit strong of a statement, but like, he does not adopt, like, as I asked him, he did not adopt this to be true, all right? So I'm going to say probably not, and that circumstantial evidence matters here, right? This is something where, now I know that Essence of Thought has brought this up in his videos, and I know that Essence of Thought has criticized the fact that Xanderhal has brought this up in his videos, But the fact of the matter is, Xanderhal does a lot of really good work for the trans community. Like, he has repeatedly gone out of his way to defend trans issues, to defend people who are trans, and to debate people who are transphobic and have transphobic ideas. And like, that does not read as someone who genuinely believes that the opinions of trans people can categorically be dismissed because they experience abuse, right? Now, again, I think that there is some, like, the next layer of this argument, and this is the argument that Essence of Thought makes, is that, oh, well, Xanderhal just makes these arguments so that he can take advantage of the trans community because that way he's able to buy their support, right? If he, I believe that the exact quote from Essence of Thought was that, oh, I just debated this transphobe. How many, do I get another 5 misgenderings? And I'm just not sure how valid that idea is. It seems really short-sighted to me to try and argue that someone is appealing to an audience that they are also specifically trying to attack. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but like, it just seems like a ridiculous idea to me, right? The idea that you are trying to pander to an audience, which you are at the same time trying to subvert, and that you are trying to harm. Like, in order to get a giant platform as large as he has, with 30,000 people, a large majority, actually I won't say a large majority, I'm technically not sure, but I know that there's a lot of trans people who follow him, myself included. And it's hard to say that all those people are not that they all feel like they're being negatively affected and still continue to watch him in spite of that. It just does not seem reasonable to me. Granted, I understand that's an argument that can technically be made, but it just does not seem reasonable to me. And so in terms of the preponderance and the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, I'm going to say it's not there, right? Like, preponderance, it definitely weighs, like, to me, it weighs much more in favor of Xanderhal. Third, does he act with the mindset of contempt? And here I'm going to say it's arguable. And here's the reason why I'll say that. He's clearly not acting with overt contempt, right? Like, obviously he's not. He has not done anything which would suggest, at least to me, that he has negative feelings towards the trans community at large, right? Like, that has not been conveyed to me, at least in any clear and convincing statements. But there is sort of this question of whether or not he's acting like the race realists do. Oh, I don't actually hate trans people. It's not like I'm, categorizing all trans people like this. It's just, these specific trans people who have been affected by childhood abuse, right? I see the argument for that. Do I think that? Now, this is something which, unfortunately, I can't say much more on this than that and offer this to you as an audience, because it does require going to his mindset. And I think that there's enough evidence that this can go either way, right? Like, this is something where circumstantial evidence matters. And the thing about contempt is that I probably personally, if I'm going to offer my personal opinion on this, I don't think that he necessarily falls into this category of contempt, or meets this element rather, just because it seems like it would require sort of a fundamental, at least negative attitude to rely on language from earlier towards the group of people. And that's just something I'm not seeing based on circumstantial evidence. But again, people can come to different conclusions on that. So beyond a reasonable doubt, no. Preponderance of the evidence, I'm going to leave that to you as the audience. Did he target a group of people? This is arguable, right? Going back to the fact that on one hand, he said that, going back to the idea that his argument as it was made could be broadened. Like, in the way that he argued it, I'm not, like, again, he said that that was not his intention, but in the way that he argued it, it could have been broadened to include all trans people, because all trans people, or most trans people, suffer childhood abuse, and therefore most trans people can grow up to have a certain mindset of, or certain mental disease or mindset of abusive behavior, right? Like, the way that he made that argument opened the door for that interpretation. And it's arguable that that means that he was targeting a group of people when he did that. But on the other hand, he did say explicitly that that was not his intention. I'm going to take that as what I primarily make my decision based off of, but I understand that there are arguments for both sides of that. Yeah, on the other hand, the argument he made can be implied categorically, right? So beyond a reasonable doubt, no. Preponderance of the evidence, again, I'll leave that one to you. So, to wrap to start wrapping up this conversation, or at least to bring up my conclusion, do I think beyond a reasonable doubt that Xanderhal is a bigot based on these actions that we talked about? No. I think that there are plenty of other explanations for why he did the things that he did, a lot of them that we went over at further in depth. Now, do I think that he's a bigot if we go by a preponderance standard? I think that it's, like, the thing about it is that I definitely see the argument, right? Like, a lot of people, like, I think that Xanderhal tried to dismiss a lot of these arguments as, just woke scolds trying to cancel him, or woke scolds just being mad at him for no reason. And I do not think that, right? I think that there's a lot more argument here, and I think that I've shown that there is a lot more nuance, especially, like, we haven't even talked about all the stuff on Twitter, right? Like, that is a whole nother discussion, right? And that's another evaluation for whether or not he might be a bigot, because that's additional information, but we just cannot go over all of that right now, right? But, right, based on this, I think that it's a reasonable argument to make. Ultimately, I don't think that this passes a preponderance standard because it requires a degree of intent, right? It requires a degree of intent which shows a very negative feeling towards the trans community. It requires a certain mindset, which it just doesn't seem like he has, right? Now, I think that based on the earlier analysis, is it arguable that he did things which are ableist or transphobic, or made arguments which are ableist or transphobic? I think that that is true. I do. I think that the arguments he made in the video that we talked about at the beginning definitely had transphobic or ableist implications in them. But I also think that because of the way that it was communicated, it seems like there was a primary issue in communication. And it seems like the issue was not so much that he was trying to intend to harm trans people or people who suffer from some kind of mental defect or disease, but that he didn't communicate his ideas properly, right? And because of that, the proper remedy seems to be, if I could, advocate for a remedy, again, like, I don't have any power here. I'm just making this video in the hopes that, Xanderhal and Essence of Thought watch this. It might be good to make an apology. It might be good to make an apology, Xanderhal, right? Because, yes, you did not do, and, like, I don't think that you're a bigot. I don't think that you're a bigot. And, like, we acknowledge, like, I think that we both agree that the things that you said are not the most founded. And I understand where you're coming from. I understand that, wanting to apologize to Essence of Thought is like pulling teeth. Like, I get that, right? You both are like oil and water, right? I totally understand where you are coming from. Completely, right? I want you to understand that where I'm coming into this is not to try and make war. I'm not. I am really trying to put some finality on this. I'm really trying to make peace. I didn't think I would have an opportunity to. I didn't know how my first video was going to go over. I did not know whether or not I was going to be able to affect either of you at all. But the coolest thing is that I've been able to. And I want to try and push that as far as I can, because the fact of the matter is, you two being as large creators as you are, let's face it, both of you are going to have comparably around the same audience before too long. And both of you have a very strong leftist community. And having this division between the both of you is only creating division in the larger movement. It is. And if what you want to do is try to defend your ground and, preserve your integrity and yada yada, then yeah, I guess you can ignore Essence of Thought. And Essence of Thought, you can ignore Xanderhal, and you both can go on doing your things, but you're driving a wedge between the movement. I think that it's justified to give Essence of Thought an apology, like a sincere apology, right? On this issue. I do. And I also think that Essence of Thought, you shouldn't like put the way that you request an apology in such a way where it comes off very scathingly to the people that you want an apology from. Because like if you ever want an apology, and I understand that there are other arguments that, you know, you shouldn't have to be nice, and you shouldn't have to be a good little tran in order to get an apology. Like I get that. I understand the argument for it. But as a practical matter, if you are talking to someone and what you want is an apology, the last thing that you want to do is to insult them, because that's going to mean that the last thing that they want to do is to give you an apology, right? I understand the policy concerns. I understand why you might not want to be nice to this person. I get all of that. I do. But understand that there are larger implications about the leftist movement, because you two as content creators have a lot riding on this. Now, as a little bit of dicta, as we call it, or I guess if I was making like a formal opinion here, like imagine if this was like a law, or if this was like an opinion by a judge at law. Dicta is something which is included by a judge in an opinion, which isn't necessarily relevant to the immediate discussion, but something that the judge thinks is interesting to include nonetheless for the benefit of the parties. And so this is my gift to you, Essence of Thought, as dicta. I want you to entertain the question of, what if Xanderhal is a bigot? What does it matter? Now you might look at me, audience, I want you to stay with me. I want you to stay with me, all right? Because this goes back to, for people who are watching, I think I have largely a leftist audience, but for those of you who are not aware, PhilosophyTube recently put out a video, and it's a video on the nature of creators and the cultures of the fans that they facilitate. All right? And what Oliver Thorne talked about in that video, towards the end of it, he talked about the Sandy Hook shooting, and how after it took place, there were a lot of conservative YouTubers who went to him in private and who talked about the fact that they were afraid because they knew that they had blood on their hands. They were afraid because they knew that even if they recognized that the thing that they caused to happen was wrong, they couldn't get out of it because they had dug themselves into such a hole with their audience, with the messages that they had continued to put out. They had dug themselves into such a place where now they have to keep going. Now their livelihoods are dependent on the fan bases that they've facilitated. Even though they recognize that what they did probably led to, if not definitely led to, the Sandy Hook shooting, they've got to keep going. They're slaves to their audiences. And to that extent, you could probably say the same inversely for most creators, leftist content creators, including Xanderhal. Because let's say that Xanderhal is operating with an intention that, I'm just doing, like, I'm literally just pandering to a leftist audience, and especially a trans audience, so that I could buffer my views and so that I can, make more money. Like, let's say that, and that he actually hates trans people and thinks that they're terrible and that they should be silenced and yada, yada, yada. Let's say that he's operating with that sort of mindset. The problem with this, for him, in this situation, is that he has facilitated a culture, a fan base, which has an expectation set for him, right? His fan base expects certain messages from him. His fan base expects him to act a certain way. This is what happened in the video where I criticized him. Way back at the beginning of this video, when we talked about the stream where all of this sort of genesis from, at least as far as my participation in the conversation happened, that was a great example where we saw that he was making an argument and his audience made sure to catch him on something that they didn't agree with. And the fact of the matter is, if he ever tries to step out of line and make something which is so egregiously outrageous, then his audience will hold him to a higher expectation. I don't want to say he's necessarily a slave to his audience, but that sort of is the condition that a lot of us creators are in. If we facilitate a certain expectation, and especially an expectation of leftist creators, then to not meet that expectation may mean compromising our livelihood, or at least our social platform. So even if you do believe that he's bigoted, I think that there is you can rest a little bit knowing that he has an audience which now has an expectation that he is not to be bigoted, that he's not to be transphobic, and that he is not to be ableist. So do with that what you will.